The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him. And she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
God of all grace and tender mercy, I speak in your name and in your presence, asking that my words would be pleasing to you, guided by your Spirit, and that the hearts and minds of your people would be open to you. Through Christ our Lord, I pray. Amen. You look beautiful. It's good to be here. So yesterday afternoon, my wife, Betsy, asked me, "What's the gospel passage?" And I said, "Well, it's the story of the Syro-Phoenician woman." And she said, "Oh, is that the woman who had 5 husbands?" I said, "No, that's the Canaanite woman at the well. The Syro-Phoenician woman is the woman to whom Jesus said, 'You can't give the children's bread to dogs.'" She said, "That's unfortunate." And then there was just a little bit of a pause, and she said, "I think the Bible needs an overhaul." So let's see. Really, Jesus? Did you really call this woman a dog? And the answer is yes. And so what's this about? How can we understand this story? So, it's a fun story, actually. Well, maybe not. There are fun parts in it, I should say. As far as I can tell, and my favorite commentator on the Gospel of Mark says this woman is the only person in the Gospels that wins an argument with Jesus. I kind of like that part, don't you? But what's happening here? So, and I think it's the only such story in all the Gospels where Jesus says anything like this. Now, there's times when he's really unhappy with the religious leaders and he's castigating them, but that's a whole different thing than this circumstance. What's happening? And wait a minute, Jesus, aren't you the one who was so kind and gracious to the woman at the well, and the woman caught in adultery, and the woman with the hemorrhage, and the Gadarene demoniac, and story after story? Jesus, wait a minute, you were the one that was always seeing the person. What's happening here? So, backing up just a little bit in Mark's story, this is roughly the middle of chapter 7. In chapter 6, he and his disciples are in several sea crossings where they're crossing over to the other side and crossing over into Gentile territory, and the disciples do not want to go. And Mark has a very clever way of demonstrating the disciples' resistance to that. And that kind of starts or accelerates, it's actually not the beginning, but it accelerates this resistance all through the Gospel of Mark of how Jesus' audience resists his ministry to the Gentiles. And kind of all about the religion of the day that was exclusive. So just the story just before this one, the religious leaders come to Jesus and say, your disciples do not ritually wash their hands before they eat, and therefore they are impure. And Jesus just kind of rolls his eyes at that and ends up in a dialogue with them. I won't do the whole thing, but the bottom line is, understand that nothing you ingest can make you impure. Whatever you ingest just goes into the stomach and then goes out. That's not what will make you impure. The purity of the person is all about the heart. What's in your heart? And typically, from the heart, the mouth speaks. And whatever is in your heart tells the truth of you, not what you put into your stomach. And so, that's okay. So he ends up in that sort of controversy with the religious people. He goes back into the house, and his disciples come to him back in the house and say, Master, tell us the parable. What's the meaning? And Jesus says, what? What? What do you not understand? How do you not understand this, he says. And this then becomes poignant. And nobody in this room is an exception to this truth, including me. We all see from our perspective. And most of us, now this part's not true of everybody, to some degree or another, we look to reinforce our perspective. We have selective hearing and seeing and listening. Yes? Come on. And we're always looking for what will reinforce what I already think and see and believe and what's important to me and what makes me feel safe and makes me feel certain and sure in the world. That's the data I'm looking at. If there's any other data, excuse me, I don't care. Not listening. And so the disciples I'm not sure where they are on that spectrum, but they just have this perspective that's been inculcated in them from their religion, and they're looking at the world a certain way, and Jesus gives them an obvious, simple example of, let's go deeper into the truth of our story, and they can't do it. And so he tells it to them again. Out of the heart comes the truth of the person, and if there's a problem, the heart tells you, not what you eat. So, I'm going to ask you to do something, please. Look at your bulletin, please. Look at the gospel passage in your bulletin, please. Pull your bulletin out. A conversation with the disciples has just ended, and what does it say? Jesus determined or set out to go to Tyre, right? Jesus decided from that conversation, he said, you know what, I'm going to go into Tyre now. Well, Tyre was a despised region for the Jewish people. It was mostly Gentile, and it colluded with Israel's enemies in the Jewish-Roman War, and even before that, it colluded with Israel's enemies, the citizens of Tyre, and were involved in really the decimation of many Jewish people. So it was a despised, hated region. I think Jesus is on his way to that region looking for another teaching opportunity. So he decides to go to Tyre, and then Mark tells us this woman comes, and she is a Gentile. The citizens of Tyre are mostly Gentile, predominantly Gentile, but Mark makes it clear this woman was of Gentile origin and a Syrophoenician. And she comes in about as humble a way as possible. So I think Jesus immediately knows, first, I think he knows this woman's not going to receive a no. Thank you. And I think he immediately knows what he's going to do. But these people were hated. So this woman falls down on the ground. Couldn't be more humble. Calls Jesus Lord. I know our translation says sir. The word could be translated sir or Lord. I think she's honoring him. Calls him Lord, asks for help for her daughter, and then Jesus says, we cannot give the children's bread to dogs. And only a mother will assume that place to get what she wants for her daughter. Even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table. And in that moment, she bests Jesus. And Jesus says, yes, because you have said this, your daughter is well, the demon has been cast out from her, go home. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and Jesus all along had that in himself, and she changed his mind. That's possible. That's not how I read it, because of all the rest I know about Jesus. My suspicion is that when Jesus said, you can't give the children's bread to dogs, he's looking all around the room. He's not even looking at her. He's saying, he's getting everybody else's attention, and he's watching, and he's seeing how are they participating in this story. What are they thinking? And there's every chance they're going, yeah. And then Jesus gives her what she wants, to the shock of all those there. And it would be his way of saying, no human being is despised or a dog, but every human being is a child of God. Every human being is a child of God. Every human being is a child of God and worthy of the bread. All are worthy of the bread. Amen.